3 Russian MiG-31 Foxhound fighter jets took off in unison from the Chalov Air Base, their engines roaring like thunder across the frozen morning air. Within seconds, they were climbing sharply toward 45,000 feet, cutting through the clouds with ease. The mission, officially a high-speed patrol, was in reality a deliberate provocation. The MiG's route was charted to brush against NATO's defensive perimeter, specifically over Estonia, to test the alliance's response and collect data on its radar systems. Confident in their aircraft's speed and altitude superiority, the Russian pilots switched off their transponders and adopted an aggressive formation. At that height, 45,000 feet was low for a MiG-31, an aircraft capable of flying beyond 80,000 feet at Mach 283, nearly 3 times the speed of sound. But this was by design. They wanted to be seen. They wanted NATO's systems to light up, its controllers to scramble fighters, and its media to react. The plan was simple. Enter Estonian airspace under the pretense of a navigation mistake, trigger a predictable NATO response, and return home as heroes after forcing Western pilots into a routine interception. The men in the cockpits were calm, almost bored. They had done this before. One joked that the NATO pilots were probably still finishing their coffee. They expected 2 F-16s from Lithuania to rise and escort them out, the usual diplomatic ritual in the skies. In their minds, it was nothing more than a harmless game of cat and mouse. Except this time, the mouse had decided to remain silent. What they didn't know was that from the moment their engines ignited, NATO's Combined Air Operations Center in Uedem, Germany, had already flagged their flight as a high-priority track. But the order issued that morning was unlike any before. It was not to scramble interceptors immediately. Instead, it was to let the MiGs enter Allied airspace. Let them come in. Let them reveal everything. This wasn't hesitation. It was a calculated setup. As the Russian fighters crossed into Estonian airspace over the Gulf of Finland, each minute deepened their overconfidence. The 5th minute passed, then the 10th. Still no response. The pilots exchanged relaxed chatter over the radio, laughing about NATO's supposed cowardice. Their massive Zaslon M passive electronically scanned array radars swept the skies with precision, yet their screens showed nothing threatening. Only civilian traffic and empty air. The illusion of safety was perfect. The Russians didn't realize that while they were scanning for enemies, they had already been found, classified, and targeted. Dozens of kilometers southwest, a pair of Italian F-35A Lightning II jets had silently taken off from Amari Air Base in Estonia. These 5th-generation aircraft flew in absolute electronic silence, maintaining low altitude and using no active radar emissions. They were invisible hunters, tracking the MiGs step by step without ever announcing their presence. The F-35's powerful AN/APG-81 AESA radars operated in low probability of intercept mode, sending out signals so faint and coded that the MiG-31's outdated radar warning systems couldn't even register them. Every move, every speed change, every engine temperature fluctuation of the MiGs was being recorded and transmitted in real time to NATO's command center. The stealth fighters acted as flying data harvesters, vacuuming up the electromagnetic signatures emitted by the Russian aircraft, their radar frequencies, data link exchanges, and power fluctuations. Unbeknownst to the Russian pilots, NATO intelligence analysts were watching their flight like an unfolding autopsy, dissecting every electronic pulse from Russia's most capable interceptor. And the F-35s were not the only players in the operation. Dozens of kilometers farther west, 2 Swedish JS-39E Gripen fighters were flying parallel to the MiG's route. Their radars were off, but they were fully integrated into NATO's Link 16 network, receiving real-time targeting and sensor data directly from the F-35s. These Gripens were no ordinary jets. The E variant, the newest version, was built specifically to counter advanced Russian aircraft and air defense systems. Its electronic warfare suite, Raven ES-05 AESO radar, and network-centric design allowed it to see through the eyes of any friendly aircraft within range. In essence, the Gripens could see what the F-35s saw without ever revealing themselves. Inside NATO's command center, the order finally came through. One word only: engage. The Russian pilots, unaware that their flight had turned from a demonstration into a trap, continued cruising. Then, in an instant, their world changed. Inside the cockpits of the MiG-31s, chaos erupted without warning. One moment, their radars displayed a clear, stable horizon. The next, the screens filled with noise, clouds of static, false targets, and blinking warnings. The pilots cursed, thinking it was a malfunction. But then the radio channels began to crackle, turning into a storm of white noise. The electronic warfare systems of the Swedish Gripens had come alive. Within seconds, the MiG-31's Zaslon M radars, once considered the pride of Russian engineering, became useless. The passive arrays were overwhelmed by coordinated jamming that mimicked hundreds of false radar signatures. The pilots tried to switch frequencies, recalibrate, and reboot their systems, but every attempt was drowned out by interference. Their radar warning receivers began screaming with the unmistakable tone of an active missile lock. "This can't be right," one of the Russian pilots muttered, checking his instruments. But when he glanced outside the canopy, his blood ran cold. Emerging from the thin haze below, two JAS-39E Gripens rose into view, sleek and menacing, climbing in perfect synchronization. On their wingtips gleamed the sharp fins of Meteor beyond visual range air-to-air missiles, their seekers already locked on target. For the first time in the flight, the Russian formation broke its calm. The MiGs began evasive maneuvers, banking hard to the left, trying to climb. But the Gripens didn't flinch. Their radar locks were absolute, their firing solutions already computed. The electronic battle was over before it began. The Swedish aircraft, linked directly to the F-35s through the secure data network, knew everything about the MiGs, their vector, altitude, and every pulse of their radar. Without ever turning on their own radar systems until the last second, they had achieved complete tactical control. From their cockpits, the Gripen pilots watched the disoriented Russian jets wobble in confusion. The lead Gripen pilot, call sign Frost, activated his communication system on the emergency frequency. His voice, calm and devoid of emotion, sliced through the static. "Russian fighter jets, you are in Estonian and NATO airspace. Your electronic systems are under our control. Your radars are inoperative. Multiple missiles are locked on your position. You have one option: return immediately to Russian airspace. This is not a warning, it is an order." For the Russian pilots, it was the end of all illusions. The superiority they had believed in, the speed, the altitude, the power, meant nothing now. The sky around them, once their battlefield, had turned into a cage. They were flying blind, deaf, and entirely exposed. The leader of the Russian formation tried to reach ground control, but the only thing that came through his headset was a distorted voice repeating, turn back immediately." It was not a suggestion. It was desperation. The F-35s, still invisible to Russian radar, hovered silently in the background, recording everything. Their sensors captured the frantic maneuvers, the failed communication attempts, and the growing panic inside the MiG formation. It was the perfect intelligence harvest, a live demonstration of Russia's technological limits under real combat conditions. The Gripens didn't fire. They didn't need to. The psychological impact of total domination was more devastating than any missile strike. After a few tense seconds, the MiGs broke formation and banked sharply eastward, retreating at high speed. The Swedish pilots tracked them until they crossed the Estonian border, then disengaged. Inside NATO's command center in Uedem, The large tactical screens flickered as the red enemy icons moved out of friendly airspace. The room was silent for a moment, not with relief, but with a deep, satisfied understanding. NATO hadn't just defended its skies, it had rewritten the rules of air superiority. The MiG-31s landed back at their base to the uneasy quiet of ground crews who didn't know what had happened. No missiles had been fired, no dogfight had occurred, but the defeat was total. For the pilots, it was a humiliation, a revelation of how far behind their systems truly were. That day, a new precedent was born. NATO's commanders declared that any future violation of Allied airspace would no longer be met with passive interception or polite escorting. The next intrusion, they decided, would trigger immediate engagement, with lethal force if necessary. Even US President Donald Trump, addressing reporters afterward, was blunt. "I don't love it. I don't love it when that happens. Such rogue behavior shouldn't be tolerated. They should be shot down if necessary." The message was clear. The era of safe provocations was over. To the outside world, the encounter over Estonia seemed like a minor diplomatic incident, quickly contained and easily forgotten. But inside NATO's intelligence community, the event was regarded as something else entirely, a turning point. The operation had not been about shooting down Russian aircraft. It had been about revealing the limitations of one of Russia's most advanced interceptors, the MiG-31 Foxhound, and testing NATO's capacity to dominate the electromagnetic spectrum. What emerged from that brief 12-minute confrontation was a devastating technical profile of the MiG-31's vulnerabilities. The F-35s had collected every byte of the aircraft's radar emissions, communication frequencies, and response patterns to electronic interference. Engineers in secure facilities were now analyzing those signals frame by frame, constructing what they called an electronic fingerprint of the Foxhound. It was as if they had peeled back the skin of the jet to study its electronic soul. The MiG-31's legendary performance figures, Mach 2.3 top speed, an operational ceiling above 80,000 feet, and a radar powerful enough to detect targets 400 kilometers away, had always given it an aura of invincibility. But this encounter showed that such speed and altitude were meaningless against a modern, network-centric battle system. The Foxhound was built in an era when air combat was measured in distance and velocity. In 21st century warfare, the real battles were fought with information, stealth, and synchronization. At the heart of NATO's strategy was something the Russian pilots never saw: a web of interlinked assets working as one organism. The F-35s acted as the sensory core, feeding data to the Gripens and other Allied platforms through Link 16 and satellite relays. AWACS aircraft, high above the Baltic Sea, monitored everything, serving as the brain that integrated radar, infrared, and communication signals from dozens of platforms simultaneously. It was not one fighter against another. It was a network versus a single node. The MiG-31's design philosophy became its undoing. Its airframe was massive, its engines optimized for straight-line acceleration rather than agility. At Mach 2.8, the jet could outrun almost anything, but it could not hide. The friction generated by its speed made its fuselage glow in infrared, a perfect beacon for modern electro-optical targeting systems like the F-35's EOTs, or heat-seeking missiles, such as the AIM-9X Sidewinder. At that velocity, it was visible hundreds of kilometers away. Physics itself betrayed it. Even worse, its radar warning receivers, the very systems designed to detect threats, were outdated relics compared to NATO's stealth and low-probability intercept radars. The Foxhound's electronic warfare suite had no defense against the sophisticated digital jamming employed by the Gripens. Its cockpit instruments, built on analog principles, couldn't interpret the subtle spectrum deception used by fifth-generation aircraft. To the Russian pilots, It was as if ghosts had filled the sky, invisible but deadly precise. The speed that once made the MiG-31 untouchable now became a trap. At Mach 2.8 and 80,000 feet, any sharp maneuver could cause the airframe to fracture or the engines to flame out due to lack of oxygen. That meant if a missile lock occurred, as it did, there was no physical escape. The pilot could neither outturn nor outrun a modern ramjet-powered weapon. The very physics that enabled its interception missions now guaranteed its destruction in an engagement. The September 19th incident had shown this perfectly. By the time the MiGs realized they were targeted, the F-35s and Gripens had already completed the kill chain electronically. The engagement required no missile launch. The message itself was enough. But NATO analysts knew that if a real fight broke out, the outcome would be no different. The MiG-31 was a relic of an older doctrine, a weapon built to intercept high-altitude American bombers in straight lines, not to survive in the chaos of modern electronic warfare. In the skies above Estonia, that doctrine collapsed. The analysis that followed in the days after the Estonian incident left no room for doubt. NATO's experts concluded that the MiG-31's advantages, its altitude, its speed, its reach, had become its own weaknesses. The aircraft was an interceptor, not a fighter. It was built to chase lumbering bombers, not to survive against smart, networked opponents who could see everything and remain unseen themselves. At Mach 283, the MiG-31 was a rocket with wings, fast but predictable. The enormous stresses on its airframe limited how sharply it could maneuver. At those speeds, a single abrupt turn could tear its wings apart or stall its engines in the thin stratosphere. In practical terms, that meant one thing: the MiG could run, but it could never dodge. Once targeted by a modern missile, it was as good as dead. To prove this point, NATO analysts simulated the same encounter, but at the MiG-31's preferred high-altitude conditions, 80,000 feet. They introduced into the scenario NATO's most advanced air-to-air weapons, the MBDA Meteor and the AIM-120D AMRAAM. The results were conclusive. Even in its ideal environment, the Foxhounds' chances of survival were effectively zero. The Meteor, developed by European engineers, represented the cutting edge of missile technology. Unlike traditional solid-fuel rockets that lose speed and energy after the first few seconds of flight, the Meteor carried a ramjet engine, a system that inhaled air to sustain combustion and maintain thrust over vast distances. This gave it an unprecedented combination of range and endurance. When launched from an aircraft like a Gripen or a Eurofighter Typhoon, the Meteor would first climb steeply in what pilots call a loft maneuver, reaching altitudes comparable to the MiG-31's cruising height. As other missiles slowed and bled energy, the Meteor accelerated. Its ramjet ignited, propelling it to speeds exceeding Mach 4. In a head-on engagement, the missile could strike a target 100 to 130 kilometers away. Even from the rear, it could destroy a fleeing aircraft at distances of 30 to 50 kilometers. For a MiG-31 flying straight and fast, there was no escape. A missile closing in at Mach 4 from the front reduced the reaction window to seconds. Evading was physically impossible. The MiG couldn't pull the G-forces necessary to survive such an encounter, and slowing down meant death by another missile coming from behind. The AIM-120D, NATO's workhorse missile, added another layer of inevitability. Its improved motor, longer range, and two-way data link allowed it to receive live targeting updates from platforms like the F-35 or an AWACS aircraft long after launch. Even if the target maneuvered or changed altitude, the missile's course could be corrected mid-flight with precision. Its initial burst speed of nearly Mach 4 gave it overwhelming momentum, and though it decelerated toward the end of its trajectory, it remained fast enough to catch any known Russian aircraft. The simulations showed what the pilots in Estonia already knew. Once detected and targeted, the MiG-31 was defenseless. It was too large to hide, too rigid to evade, and too electronically primitive to counter the attack. But the implications of this went far beyond a single aircraft. In the command center at Uedem, the senior officers understood that NATO had just proven the supremacy of its integrated air network. The system of shared sensors, stealth fighters, and data-linked missiles that allowed each unit to act as a piece of a single mind. It wasn't about one pilot outsmarting another. It was about a web of machines thinking faster than any human could. In that 12-minute incident, NATO had demonstrated the end of a military era. Speed no longer ruled the sky. Information did. The lesson was harsh for Russia. The same attributes that once made the MiG-31 a legend, its brute force, its altitude, its radar range, now made it obsolete in a digital battlefield, dominated by stealth, synchronization, and silent communication. Back at the Chalov Air Base, Russian pilots who had once joked about NATO's cowardice stood in stunned silence as engineers combed through their flight recorders. The data revealed the moment their radars went blind, the point at which their instruments lost all coherence, and the exact second when a Swedish pilot's calm voice had taken command of their fate. No missiles had been fired, but the psychological damage was irreversible. In the days following the confrontation, the quiet corridors of NATO headquarters buzzed with a restrained satisfaction. The operation over Estonia had done more than repel a provocation. It had demonstrated the full maturity of NATO's next-generation defense doctrine. What happened on September 19th wasn't just a tactical success, it was a strategic revelation. The alliance had proved that through synchronization of intelligence, stealth technology, and electronic dominance, even the fastest and most fearsome enemy aircraft could be rendered helpless without a single shot being fired. Behind closed doors, representatives from Estonia, Poland, Sweden, and Germany gathered to discuss what came next. The mood was tense, but resolute. Estonia's defense minister spoke first, his voice steady but sharp. For too long, we have treated these violations as theater. Polite escorts, radio warnings, diplomatic protests. Russia knows the limits of our rules. They push them because we allow it. Poland's representative nodded. They've mistaken our restraint for fear. That ends now. The Swedish and German delegations agreed. The old policy of merely shadowing intruding aircraft was over. What was needed was deterrence, not in words, but in capability and intent. Germany's Air Command proposed a new protocol, the re-establishment of active deterrence. This meant that the next deliberate violation of NATO airspace would not be met with a warning, but with force, and that decision would be pre-authorized, not debated in real time. The debate lasted for hours, blending military calculation with political caution. By evening, a consensus had formed. NATO would adopt a new engagement rule, simple and absolute. Any hostile aircraft entering Allied airspace under aggressive or deceptive circumstances would be classified as a legitimate threat and could be engaged without further authorization. It was a line drawn not in sand, but in the sky. While diplomats prepared to brief their governments, NATO's intelligence units compiled the technical findings from the September 19th operation. They had captured not only radar and electronic signatures of the MiG-31s, but also their communication patterns and behavioral responses under jamming pressure. The data revealed a staggering truth. Russia's most advanced interceptor was generations behind in electronic warfare and situational awareness. In the operations room at Uedem, officers replayed the incident one last time. On the massive tactical display, the red icons representing the MiG-31s flickered, then retreated eastward out of Estonian airspace. The green icons of the F-35s and Gripens remained steady, motionless, perfectly synchronized. No one cheered. There was no need. The silence itself was the victory. Back in Moscow, the response was muted and defensive. Official statements dismissed the encounter as routine air policing. Yet, inside Russia's Air Force Command, the mood was grim. The debriefings revealed an undeniable reality. Their pilots had been digitally paralyzed, their communication cut, their sensors deceived, and their aircraft outclassed. No amount of propaganda could change what had happened. That 3 of Russia's most powerful jets had been cornered, humiliated, and forced to retreat without a fight. For NATO, the lesson was clear. Air superiority no longer depended on who flew higher or faster, but on who could see, connect, and control the invisible threads of information that bound the battlefield together. The combination of F-35s, Gripens, AWACS, and data-linked missiles had created a single, lethal ecosystem, one that could observe, decide, and strike faster than any opponent could react. When the new engagement rules were quietly enacted across Europe's northern air defense network, they carried an unmistakable message. The next time a MiG-31 or any other hostile aircraft crossed into NATO airspace, the response would not be limited to jamming or warnings. It would be decisive. A statement released days later summarized it with diplomatic precision, but unmistakable intent. The era of cost-free provocations is over. Any further violation of NATO airspace will be met with appropriate and proportionate action. Deterrence remains the cornerstone of our collective defense. For the first time in decades, the skies above the Baltics were utterly quiet. The Russian MiGs stayed home. And somewhere in the silent hangars of Amari Air Base, 2 F-35s rested under dim lights. Their mission complete, their message delivered without a single missile fired. The battle for air supremacy had evolved beyond speed, beyond steel, beyond noise. In 12 minutes over Estonia, it had entered the age of silence.